Welcome to the Trad Dads podcast, where we examine cultural and political issues through the lens of traditional thought.
All right, this is Levi R. Thanks for joining me. This week, I want to talk about economies of scale and how the different perspectives out there on politics and economics treat economies of scale. So first of all, what is economies of scale? Well, it's a concept in economics that says that if you have a fixed cost, and a lot of times the example would be like a pizza oven. You have a pizza oven that costs the same no matter how many pizzas you make with it. So that would be an example of a fixed cost. If you have a fixed cost, then it makes sense to make as many, to produce as many items as you can to reduce the cost of each item on average. So let's say the pizza oven costs $1,000 and I make 10 pizzas. Well, then per pizza, the fixed cost of that pizza oven is $100. But if I go back and I take that same $1,000 pizza oven and I make 1,000 pizzas, then the fixed cost is only $1 per pizza. So, putting aside repairs and stuff like that, obviously those things are variable to an extent. That, the more you wear out the machinery, the more often you're going to have to repair it or something like that. But the initial cost of the pizza oven itself is a fixed cost, certainly. And so that gives you economies of scale. It means that the more you produce, the lower average cost per item. And so, obviously, economies of scale has been a huge component of innovation, certainly since the Industrial Revolution. And I'm not an expert on the history of this sort of thing, so I'm not going to say too much about that. But it certainly is the case that as we have increased a lot of our technologies, but I wouldn't say everything. These days, supposedly innovation is putting a slightly different tweak on a photo sharing app. Like that's innovation somehow. Maybe the case that you could call that innovation, but it's certainly not innovation in the sense that something like, a factory or an assembly line or, things like that are innovations. And so, when we talk about economies of scale outside of purely just economics, oftentimes this is discussed as being a law of economics that supposedly you can't break it, or you can't offend this law with some kind of policy. So, like for example, it may be the case that someone really likes living in a world where this idea of economies of scale is respected as something to make political decisions with. And so when someone comes and says something like, well, it may just be better to, make decisions at a local level, even if that may not be the most efficient way to do it. Maybe it would make sense to aggregate all this information, into a large company or into a large political entity, and let them decide what the production of this good or service, or this production of this infrastructure or something like that is going to look like. And so the reference, behind all of this is to cost. And actually it's explicitly to sort of the countable expenses. But just because, centralizing all of the decisions into a large political or business entity is efficient due to economies of scale, doesn't mean that that's the best way to do it in a moral sense. So we get back to sort of a theme that I bring up a lot for this show, which is that economic concepts rest on moral principles. And so if we're going to get the sort of economic policy right, we have to understand that we have to get the morality portion of it right first. So, just to give maybe a more concrete example of what we mean here. So let's say that it's someone might say that, you can't really criticize, say, Walmart too much, because Walmart has massive economies of scale. They also have massive, probably economies of scope to an extent too, but they do have massive economies of scale, right? So the fact that they themselves can coordinate this delivery system of products from the suppliers to warehouses to distribution centers, and then all of that sort of thing, and then to these big retail stores. There's economies of scale and all that, right? They own all the trucks, and they can sort of centrally, design a system that's very low cost and provides very cheap goods for people to have. And, okay, well, I guess that's okay as far as it goes, but the question is, should that be the case? Does the fact that Walmart have that control, does it diminish the choices that people are able to make in their communities? Does it diminish their ability to be different from another location in some way? Does it diminish their ability to influence what products are sold in their location? Because, of course, this goes back to the whole idea of advertising and whether or not, advertising is used to convince people to buy things, or is it used to, or is there some kind of market research on the back end that's crucial to determining what people are going to want? And I think you can make an argument either way. I think we could say that, certainly firms spend money trying to figure out what people want, but they also spend a lot of money convincing you that you need something, or that at least it's okay for you to want it and buy it. So centralizing control over the decisions of consumption decisions to an extent, because obviously, sure, Walmart isn't forcing you to buy things, but it's making certain things more available at a lower price than those things otherwise would be. And so that is all relevant to, some kind of influence on your decision whether to buy something or not from them. And so I think it's very interesting how sort of different political categories treat this issue of economies of scale. The most obvious is just your average liberal capitalist type, the conservative, libertarian, someone in that world. And of course they think economies of scale are great, that it's great that we can have more stuff at lower prices. Innovation brings, newer types of things online that expand our ability to take advantage of economies of scale. And we are able to have all of these wonderful products and services and things like this at lower and lower prices over time. And to an extent, a lot of these things do decline in price over time. And sometimes that's due to innovation or something like that. Sometimes it's due to the fact that businesses just find cheaper ways to make products by outsourcing labor or outsourcing inputs for their production processes to other countries where there's low pay, or other types of cost reducing factors. And so it doesn't always, those benefits don't always accrue to everyone, certainly. So your average sort of conservative or libertarian is going to really like economies of scale. They're not going to have any problem with this at all. And the funny thing is, though, to an extent, they will have a problem with this in the political realm. So they will at least pay lip service to the idea that, a decentralized government structure is better. But the reality is they think that because they think that for some reason the political realm whatever economies of scale, efficiencies that they might be able to obtain, that for some reason it's either not good to do it, so they're making a similar argument to what we would make, or they're concerned about some kind of inefficiency in government operation that offsets the efficiency of sort of a large economies of scale type of operation. And so it could be a moral issue, but it also could be very easily just a practical efficiency type of argument as well. So is their perspective on economies of scale, in other words, they wouldn't have much of a problem with Walmart or Amazon or any of these other people, is their perspective different from someone on the left, say? And I think that's a good question, and I think it's sort of interesting to think through it, because maybe on the surface we would say, well, the conservative libertarian fusion is totally the antithesis of the left wing. They talk about how much they don't like socialists and all of this sort of thing all the time, even to the point of lumping other people in with socialists who aren't socialists at all. And so it might seem at first that this whole idea of economies of scale and production that the conservative libertarian fusion folks really like, that maybe the left would not like that stuff. But I think there's some interesting overlap between their perspectives on economies of scale. So, for instance, if we go back to the quintessential leftist Marx, his whole idea, his whole perspective on socialism and how it was going to, affect the worker and all this sort of thing, was all about the fact that we were going to get to a certain point where, things were just going to be very cheap. And so in that case, because of the Industrial Revolution, because of the advance in technology, because of economies of scale, that is how people were going to be liberated from their oppressors and all this sort of thing. So there definitely is some kind of and you especially saw this in the French utopian socialists, right? That all of a sudden we were going to have chickens were going to fly straight into people's mouths and all this ridiculous nonsense. But it was all kind of hinging on this idea that we were going to be building these giant production processes and taking advantage of these economies of scale. So even if the average left-wing person these days claims to not like corporations, the roots of their philosophy really kind of hinge on that. But even more, you also have a sort of strain of the left who is really enamored with very, very large government entities. And oftentimes the arguments that they will make in favor of these large entities sound a lot like economies of scale arguments. So they might say something like, well, maybe it's inefficient to have a single-payer healthcare system, at the national level. Or it's inefficient to have that kind of thing at the state level or the local level or something like that. But gosh, if we just have it at the national level, then we'll be able to, really use bargaining power to crush those evil pharmaceutical companies, or we'll be able to, spread out the cost of insuring all these people across this huge swath of the population, and to the extent that we can do that, we can really lower the cost overall, and this is just standard economies of scale argument. That's all this is. But even more directly, I think, there's sort of an economies of scale just in the government itself. So this idea that if the UN itself can watch over all of these countries, or something like the Euro, the European Union. We don't need to have all these silly legislatures in all these different countries. Why not just have one legislature for all the countries in Brussels? And, then we can let those politicians make decisions for everybody. I mean, that is a textbook economies of scale argument. Why have all these groups of politicians when you can just have one set that handles all the decisions? That's economies of scale. So I don't think really that their positions, the left and the sort of conservative fusionist libertarian type, they don't really have a different perspective on economies of scale. They just kind of want it applied in slightly different areas. One wants it applied in the sort of corporate, private enterprise world, and the other wants it applied in that world to an extent, but also and primarily in the world of governments, because we want those governments to be efficient and effective, and the larger they are, the more we can centralize these decisions, the better off we can be at making sure that redistribution goes the way we want and all that sort of thing. So I think the third position on this comes from someone who's a little more traditional, and I think that the primary argument against the economies of scale issue is mainly a moral one. And so you might have a conversation with someone on, say someone in the liberal camp who would say, well, we can't just have, we can't force companies to, be a certain size, or we can't more heavily tax larger companies, or we can't, put tariffs on companies that trade across borders. We can't, do things like that, because that's just, that flies in the face of the laws of economics. Okay, sure. But, the laws of economics are not moral laws, and anything, any other type of law is really subject to the moral law. So I guess I'm not that interested in whether or not, we're going to break the laws of economics. Economies of scale is not a law. It's just simply a feature of certain happenstances in the history of humanity. If the Industrial Revolution had given us a lot of small electric motors instead of, sort of factories built around one large engine, then economies of scale would be a completely different story for us. So there's nothing sort of inherent to prosperity, really. I don't even think, even if we're just talking purely material prosperity, there's nothing inherent to economies of scale in that sense. It may be in the historical way that things have gone, and it may be very costly to try to go back and go a different direction. Sure, and I think we see that with the way battery technology has consistently failed to take off. But the bottom line is that a traditionalist is going to make the argument that, yeah, okay, I'll grant you that economies of scale, you can have reduced costs, and so maybe centralizing production or centralizing governance to an extent would quote unquote make sense if all you were concerned about was sort of the cost, the material issues, material wealth, or the reducing expenses per unit of production and that sort of thing. But that's not all we're worried about. We're also worried about localism and autonomy, and I think a phrase we're going to hear a lot more, which is the economics of place. Do places matter? Does your town matter? Does your community matter? And if so, then perhaps it makes sense to diminish the effects of economies of scale in production processes so that you can preserve that place. You can preserve a location and a community to an extent. Obviously, a very simple way of talking about this is just the buy local idea. Sure, if not every store in your town is a chain, obviously every chain would be a really good example of this sort of economies of scale, right? We can build a brand, and then we can leverage that brand and increase sales all over the country. And that's really good economies of scale. But if each town has their own method of retailing things or even producing things to an extent, then that adds to the uniqueness of that place. It gives the people who live in that place more say in the types of products and the qualities of those products that they purchase. Whereas a chain is going to say, well, we just have to, hit the average for, the public in general. We're not going to offer different things in different places. So I think, just to review, economies of scale is a perfectly valid economic concept, but we have to remember that it's important to properly rank where we're going to place economies of scale in the structure of our morality from a policy perspective. How important is economies of scale to policy decisions? Those on the left and sort of, liberal right-wing types probably would put a little bit more emphasis on economies of scale as an important characteristic of policies than someone in the traditional world. And to me, the best arguments against this whole idea that economies of scale is just some inevitable law of economics is just to simply say that really it's just an empirical feature of, the modern world, and that it's potentially the case that we might have some moral considerations that outweigh the importance of economies of scale. And so with that, I will close up for the night, and I hope you've enjoyed the show. If you do, please continue to patronize the show. I'd like to thank Ralph, who's our first donor through Anchor. But you can very easily subscribe on any platform or watch us on YouTube. So thanks for your patronage.
Thanks for listening to the Trad Dads podcast. If you enjoyed our show, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app and consider giving us a 5-star rating on iTunes. It really helps us out.
The podcast you just heard was made using Anchor. Ever thought about making your own podcast? Anchor makes it really easy for anyone to get started. It's a one-stop shop for recording, hosting, and distributing podcasts. Best of all, it's 100% free. Sign up now at anchor.fm/new. That's anchor.fm/new to get started.